IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Some very dramatic developments are happening in the tech world this week, with Facebook apparently executing a threat to walk out on Australia. The reason why this is happening is because of a pretty unprecedented law that Australia has put forth, which would require Google and Facebook to really start engaging with the media outlets that they work with in order to put content on their platforms. It has some pretty significant implications for the way that these social media giants operate across the world. And it also has some significant implications for the way that media outlets, which have been profoundly affected by the operations of Google, Facebook, and other social media giants, engage with them. So without any further ado, let's try to understand what exactly has happened and figure out where the world goes from here. Over to you, Prateek. Can you tell us a little bit about this new law that Australia has proposed, and why is it exactly that Google and Facebook have had such a furious reaction to it?
Yeah, so this actually goes back about 3 years, where the Australian Competition Commission essentially conducted an inquiry into digital platforms to try and identify what kind of effects they were having. Right? They identified a bunch of adverse effects. One of which was that news content creators are reliant on these dominant digital platforms, but they face difficulties in monetizing their content. As a follow-up to that, in April last year, the Australian government asked the Competition Authority to basically develop a mandatory code to address these bargaining power imbalances. Right now, this draft code was put out sometime in July, and platforms and news broadcasters, etc., had a few months to provide their comments on it. Right? Now, what's interesting about this draft code is that it places a number of obligations on the digital platforms, and some of the more egregious ones that have been discussed very heavily, right, are things like the fact that they have to notify these news outlets if there are going to be any changes to their algorithms that can affect their business, that can affect how paywalled content is displayed, or if there are any other changes that will affect how news content is displayed or how ads are displayed, right? And the initial requirement was a 28-day advance warning, unless done in public interest, in which case they could make the changes and then inform the news outlet after that. But, and I believe the bill changes to 14 days.
This is absolutely incredible. If you think about the way that, rather than focus on what the law is saying, if you think about the fact that it's because these social media giants have such an important role to play in who reads what news, and if you look at the kind of consequences that has had over the last few years, right? Facebook, for example, constantly recommends to you the kind of content that you find appealing, which means that on average, people tend to drift into these echo chambers or social media bubbles where they're only exposed to news that they find interesting. Google, on the other hand, has also shaped the way that people think about information on various topics in very subtle but very profound ways. How many of you actually look to the third or fourth page of Google search results? I'm willing to bet that it's not a lot. The vast majority of us, if we're searching for information on a particular topic, we'll just Google it and then click on the very first link that shows up. As somebody who's interested in Indian history, it never ceases to amaze me how when I search for even the most generic things, I tend to be redirected quite rapidly to blogs which are, let's say, not really qualified to say anything about history. But nevertheless, as a result of that, it's meant that perceptions can be very easily shaped by stuff that appeal to people's basic instincts and not necessarily are based on facts. So now if Australia comes in and says that you're going to have to notify media outlets when your algorithm changes, which means that everybody can tweak their content in order to remain on the top of Google search results, that's quite significant. On the other hand, if you're going to ask Google to pay outlets for showing their content on search results, again, like it's not necessarily going to favor more fact-based media outlets, but it's going to favor media outlets which have a large amounts of clout already in the first place. So it's going to have some fairly significant consequences should it actually come to pass. It's going to profoundly shape information ecosystems, which means that by extension, it's going to shape politics just as Google and Facebook have over the last few years, but it's also going to basically bring more powerful media outlets onto the same platform, as it were. It's going to make it more easy for them all to shape public consciousness about various ideas. So it's very significant in that sense as well. But I also think that it puts down some pretty important precedents for the way that these social media giants do business and also for the way that media outlets engage with them, right? So tell us a little bit more about that, Pratik.
Yeah, so like you said, right? So it has provisions which basically says that Google and Facebook need to enter some sort of agreement with these news platforms to pay for their content. And if they don't, it gets kicked into mandatory arbitration, where each party has to make a final offer, and then the arbitration will then go through and then decide which offer it's going to accept. But the interesting thing, it's all based on the assumption and the contested assumption that it's the platforms that are dependent on the news outlets, right? Now you can creatively make arguments either way, right? To say that, look, Google search would not be as useful as it is if it did not have news outlets and news content on there, right? Which is an argument you can certainly make. But on the flip side, right, the fact is that all these news sites are heavily reliant on Google and Facebook for their traffic. That question is not settled on in terms of whether Google and Facebook actually owe these platforms money to use their content, right? Or to simply link to them, right? And that's where this gets interesting. And it also discounts the fundamental difference between Google and Facebook in terms of how they get content, right? So now Google still goes out and crawls websites and indexes them. Any news outlet at any point in time can change their robots.txt file and stop this from happening if they choose to do so, right? But no one's really gone on and done that. Facebook, on the other hand, unless a user goes and posts content, or the news outlet themselves through their page put those links on there, that content doesn't really get out there, right? So it's also sort of conflating two very different ways in which news content makes its way to either Google search or on Facebook's platform. Right? The other interesting aspect is that the way Google and Facebook have been identified to be a part of this seems to be completely arbitrary. Right now, I'm very critical of Google and Facebook when required, but in this case, it just seems arbitrary. And there's also there's been no set of guidelines in terms of how the next set of platforms may be identified. Right. So if tomorrow we were to say, hey, Twitter is going to be made part of this code. Today, no one really knows how that's going to happen other than, the Australian Treasurer says so.
All right. So in our conversation before this, we talked about the way that these social media giants are now responding to this proposed law, right? One thing that we started the episode with also is that Facebook first threatened and then executed its threat to actually walk out from Australia in a sense. So a lot of stuff that would formerly have been shared on Facebook can no longer be shared on Facebook, and you can't access news from various media outlets on Facebook. But what is Google doing on the other hand?
Yeah, so ever since the code came out, both of them have been fairly vocal in saying that the code is unworkable, right? And they've made veiled threats to exit while continuing to negotiate with the Australian authorities, right? So apparently those negotiations are still going on. But what Google has done is Google is entering into deals with individual publishers. So they just recently announced a deal with News Corp, with Seven Media. So they're entering into those deals for their content. Facebook, as you said, made good on its threat to walk out. But what they seem to have done is not just block sharing of news content. There seems to be an overreach in the way it's been executed. And it also blocked a lot of government services, a whole bunch of other informative services as well. And that understandably led to backlash, right? And the response to this, right, even in tech policy circles, has been very tribal in a sense, right? People who are extremely vocal critics of Google and Facebook believe that this code is the right way to go, while some are arguing that, look, even if you want Google and Facebook to support journalism, maybe this code is not the right way, right? There are other ways of doing it that do not seem as arbitrary. And it's also spreading, right? What typically happens in a case like this is other countries start looking at this and say, hey, how can we do this now? Because around the same time that this happened, Google also announced a deal with a bunch of French news outlets to pay them for their content. And that was, I think, a conglomeration of about 100 French media outlets that came together and announced a deal, because there's some background over there as well. That's been going on for a year. But we're also seeing that in the EU itself, the Digital Services Act, they want to incorporate parts of this, right? So it could also serve as sort of a blueprint in the way a lot of countries are dealing with Google and Facebook and their platform power, especially when it comes to news, right?
Can I actually add a couple of things here? See, we have, for the most part of this debate and generally this podcast also, we have sort of put Google and Facebook in the same boat. And I think that's also what the Australian government is doing. They have said that Google and Facebook are the only two people that this is planned to target, and this is how we're going to take it forward. But if you look at the nature of these services and how they treat news, it's actually fairly different, and you'll see that in their responses. So Facebook actually has been trying to de-emphasize news as a part of its feed since a long time. Right? This is something that we can put in the show notes. There's a link to a Verge article that does a good job of explaining it. But as Casey Newton puts it, around 4% of stuff on the newsfeed is actually works for journalism, which is quite different from, compared to Google. Google has more stuff that's linked to journalism. And generally, if I have to look at a news story, I Google it first and then I go to news links. So generally, Google has more to lose here. And if you look at the responses, Google is also the first to blink, I think, because of this. Because the code explicitly says that, listen, if you got to have a deal outside of this code. And Facebook's response to that is, well, I don't want to have a deal. So how about I just stop people from posting links? I mean, the execution of that has been botched, but generally, Facebook has stood pretty firm on that. Google, on the other hand, has blinked and has, as Prateek said, tried to get deals with, is it 9 Media or 7 Media? I forget. And Rupert Murdoch is a big winner because Google is now going to pay him for stuff that News Corp is posting. But the other thing that we have to look at is this thing about binding arbitration, which is that the code says that there's basically a lot of binding arbitration that's going to happen if this code passes, which is that two parties have to come to an agreement. And the thing here is that platforms hate the idea of that, because imagine if a platform, let's say Google's hosting stuff from the print, right? And the Google's hosting stuff from Times of India. So, of course, Google's going to offer less money to print than it is going to offer Times of India, just as a normal example. Here, it's in the print's best interests to shoot for the moon and tell them the highest number that they possibly can. So the print will likely say that I want to shoot for the moon and I want X amount of rupees for the content that you are hosting. Times of India will also shoot for the moon and say that I need this much money. And so will every other magazine. And if the arbitration is binding, then the arbitrator is going to likely come down in the middle and say, how about you meet somewhere halfway? And Google, you pay this much to this.
So if I can jump in there, this is a point that actually they specifically address in the report that was put before the Parliament as well, which says that the arbitration will end up picking one of the two offers, right? And that's how they've specifically, they seem to be against this idea of taking the average of both deals, right? And they said the arbiter has to pick one of the two offers, which they believe is grounds for or creates the incentives for people to go in and put reasonable requests. Now, whether that actually plays out in reality, it remains to be seen. But this is the position that they have taken on.
I mean, what's likely going to happen here is that no arbitrator is going to go, oh, I feel bad for Google, the big tech giant, or I feel bad for Facebook. They are more likely, the incentive that news outlets are going to have is that if the average price is 50, they're going to ask for an 80. And you can say that this is going to overvalue their content. But I find it hard to imagine that arbitrators are going to rule in the favor of Google or Facebook if the price is not absolutely preposterous in that case. So even in that sense, I think it's a losing proposition for platforms.
See, this is why I find it a little odd that detractors of Google and Facebook are in support of this law, right? I mean, on the one hand, it is cool that Google is going to lose some money, but I mean, it's money that they can afford to lose. On the other hand, by like actually giving money to clickbaity outlets, as it were, it actually just accelerates some of the trends that we already saw in the media ecosystem. It basically means that Fox News now even has even more money to spread conspiracy theories, as do their equivalents in other countries. But speaking of other countries, I mean, that's something that's yet to happen, right? So if you're to create a law that says, okay, so companies in Australia have this deal with Google where Google has to agree to reveal changes in their algorithm and their business model to these companies, doesn't that give them an unfair advantage over the rest of the world? Do you see other countries also trying to leap onto the bandwagon and now trying to force these social media giants to come to an accommodation with existing media giants in these countries?
Oh, absolutely right. And in fact, I mentioned the deal with the French publishers, right? And a couple of days after that, the deal with, I think the News Corp deal and a couple of other deals in Australia were announced. Now, a number of them haven't publicly stated what the deals were worth, but there is a general sense that these are, that Google has agreed to pay more in Australia's case to the extent that the treasurer is actually saying that, look, the very fact that these deals are happening means that this bargaining code is actually working. And it looks like we're able to get more lucrative deals, right? Now, if countries around the world are going to be looking at that and saying, countries, publishers around the world are also going to be looking at that and saying, hey, I want a piece of this. And it's creating these incentives for this to be, followed across. We're already seeing some of that happen, right? Like I mentioned with EU looking at, amending their Digital Services Act to incorporate some elements of this. I think it's a matter of time. The way things are going, more and more countries are going to try and push similar measures on platforms.
I agree with Pratik. The thing is, it's better to wait and watch a little more, I would say, for most countries, because I'm a bit concerned about the incentive structure of what this deal is going to set, because here big corporations, big news platforms have more power than small platforms, even though the code, let me quote this from the code itself, is it enables digital platforms to publish standard offers, which provide smaller news media businesses with an efficient pathway to finalizing agreements with digital platforms. What it's basically saying is that if you are a small publisher, there will be a standard deal for you that you will take. Now, it's what defines a small publisher? How good is this standard deal going to be? Because if it's a decent deal and it offers small publishers, then what is to stop me as a micro publisher to go and take this deal, right? As someone who publishes a newsletter on Substack or so on. But my whole thing is, I think there's a better play here to wait and watch and examine how this sets the incentive structure going forward and see if the incentives it sets are compatible with those of India or let's say the EU. I mean, I think all countries are going to be watching, and that's why Facebook and Google are taking such hard stances. But it is the incentive structure that we have to keep an eye on and see how it develops.
I'm actually a little surprised that Facebook went to the extent it did, right? Because when I was looking at this last week, right, and despite whatever Australia, whatever the code says and how arbitrary it seems, right, I would have thought that the two entities that don't want people to find out that they can work fine without them were Google and Facebook. Right? Google seems to have taken that stance. I guess they didn't follow through on their veiled threats to stop serving Australian customers. Facebook seems to have gone that way, and I'm honestly a little surprised because the way I see it, right, life will go on. Right, people will find alternatives, and even though theoretically Facebook had a stronger bargaining position, I think by going and exercising this, they've probably done themselves way more harm than good. right? I also go back to the point Anirudh, you mentioned about funding Fox News, right? And that's interesting because that's specifically something Google got criticized for, right? By the very same set of people who were cheering on the fact that this code is going to support journalism, etc. Right?
It's like you said, it's just tribalism,
Yeah. So there is certainly that element of tribalism that's come into the way people are interpreting or evaluating how well this code will work, right? And the other part that you said earlier also was that when you search for content, you find very questionable outlets linked there, right? And this is in a way creating incentives for that, right? Especially if Google and Facebook stop linking to news services, right? What's going to happen is your low quality information is going to bubble up even further. Right?
Yeah,
it's creating those issues as well. Now we'll have to see how that plays out, but yeah, at this point it seems like the ones who benefit will be low quality content sources.
All right, so I think that's a good overview of how Google and Facebook are affected by this. But let's try to, before we wrap up, let's try to look at the fundamentals of what is really going on here, right? I mean, how exactly and why exactly were Google and Facebook selected? As Rohan pointed out, both of them have very different business models. Both of them engage with content from online publishers in profoundly different ways. What kind of precedent does it set that Google and Facebook are just being singled out and basically painted with the same brush and being forced to come to terms with particular outlets? Do you guys see a precedent being laid for a regulation of more social media firms like this? Would, for example, Twitter or, for example, Mastodon or any open source kind of platforms also have to deal with these rules? How do you see more generally social media platforms being shaped by this precedent in the years to come?
Yeah, and that's been one of the criticisms of this, right? That it seems very arbitrary the way Google and Facebook have been picked. The cynical assessment has been just that, okay, they have deep pockets, they can afford to pay. That's basically. Interestingly, Microsoft has come out in support of the code, not just in Australia, but saying that this is a model they would support, right? And again, I think if you take a cynical view of that, it's that Bing stands to gain where Google would lose out. So it could very easily expand to more social networks and more platforms tomorrow. No one knows on what basis these were selected, at least in terms of a set of well-reasoned criteria, right? That doesn't exist today. So potentially any other platform could be picked up in the future, right? Twitter would be interesting because the amount of news content that's shared on Twitter is far different from Facebook, right? It creates so if and when Twitter is also brought under this code, that's going to be an extremely interesting thing to watch out for, because I think Twitter's response is going to be very different from Facebook. Right? They can't afford to take the same hard stance that Facebook did. It is in a sense that a sword of Damocles, right, on any of the other platforms as well. You don't know on what basis you can be notified tomorrow, and that comes across even in the responses, right, to the bill or to the draft code. Even companies like Atlassian had gone in and responded and basically pointed out the same set of criticisms that we don't know on what basis platforms have been picked. It doesn't necessarily change the bargaining power equation that the code initially set out to do, right? As Rohan pointed out, that your in case of your smaller outlets, that imbalance still exists, right? So it doesn't solve that.
All right, Rohan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I want to actually add one thing, which is I think we should also pay more attention to what this means, not just for social media platforms, but news outlets in general going forward. Because if today the Australian government has said that this code exists and Facebook has said that you can't post links that originate in Australia, what this also means is that now more publications whose links don't generate from Australia but cover Australia are going to get more traction, right? And so international news agencies are going to get more funding in Australia, which is something that I don't think a lot of people have talked about. What this means for India, in some sense, is that if this thing does ever come here, then our news outlets are going to change in a different manner, because we have different rules about news outlets when they're international and operate in India. I think there is an investment cap, and there are also a bunch of other considerations because of which HuffPost India was shut down and so on. So not only is this going to change things for social media going forward, depending on how other countries take this, but also going to significantly change how domestic and international news outlets operate, especially if this is the kind of consideration that we are going with. So I think interesting times ahead. I wouldn't be too optimistic on how these ramifications are going to turn out, but I guess it's something that can't be helped. So yeah, bleak end to this podcast, I think.
I'm going to make it a little bleaker actually, because what Rohan said reminded me of something else. Is that, not just news outlets, right? If the idea is paying for links, right, it potentially extends far beyond just news, right? Because if we're creating a model where links have to be paid for, right? I think as Tim Berners-Lee said, you're potentially breaking the entire open internet.
Wow. And just to add a little more bleakness to all of this, let's not forget that the Indian government has been raiding small and large news outlets quite frequently in the last few weeks. We hear a lot of cases of journalists being arrested and potentially having another means by which to pressure social media platforms to remove accounts or to assist particular kinds of outlets with particular kinds of narratives is going to have some pretty significant consequences on the Indian information ecosystem in the years to come. So perhaps we can say that you should all consider moving to more open source platforms that might not necessarily come under the ambit of these laws for now. And please pay attention to how and why you're getting information on the internet and all the dynamics that are going on behind the scenes to bring it to you. On that note, thank you, Rohan and Prateek, for joining us today on All Things Policy. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors very quickly this week, thewholetruthfoods.com, Storytel, and CED. We really do appreciate your support. And we had a great week on the network this week. So tune in for some sweetness with our hosts Sadaf and Archit as they hone their sweet tooth and talk about candies. The famous, the healthy, the traditional, and international. Check out Naan Curry. You'll enjoy it. On last week's episode of The Note, Maruk and I spoke to TV presenter and columnist Veer Sanghvi, who analyzed the 2 years of the second term of the Modi government. As China and India signed the disengagement agreement along the LAC, Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon and Manoj Kewurmani joined Suyash Desai to discuss the process and the consequences it will have on the nation and in world politics. Dr. Anton Harder joins Hamsini Hariharan on States of Anarchy to discuss India's right to a seat at the United States Security Council. Ashton Doctor talks about duty, how individually it binds us and how as a society it is liberating. Check out The Habit Coach with Ashton every day. Great show and great fun to listen to that. On Football Show, to all the boys to talk about their loves and sorrows for teams and their current ranks in the world of football. And also do remember to check out Cyrus Says. We had a great week last week. We had Amol Mazumdar, the ex-cricketer. We had Rocky and Mayur. And we did the Valentine's special with Aisha and Kunal. Great fun. Do check it out. I'm sure you will enjoy that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro.
And me, Farhad.
On our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.